So how can we get change detection to run again for the messages list component? Well, we in the end need to trigger it manually. And Angular gives you the tools for triggering it manually. It gives you an object you can inject into your components to trigger change detection in those components. So we can inject that thing here, and I'll name it cd_ref for change detection ref, because what I'll inject is the change detector ref token. And that turns out to be a class. So in the end, again, it's a service provided by Angular. And you can call a method on that service to trigger change detection. The problem just is, where exactly would we call it here? We want to call it when the data in the service changes. But we can't call it in the service because this change detector ref thing needs to be used in the component which should be checked, not in the place where the changes occurred. So we need a way of finding out that something changed. We need a way of getting notified about changes in this component so that we can then trigger change detection manually. To get notified about events that could have an impact on a component, Angular uses a third-party library that's deeply incorporated into Angular, at least into parts of Angular, called RxJS. And it is part of the project I provided to you. And it is part of all Angular projects that are created. It's not part of Angular, but it's, as I just explained, used a lot by Angular internally in certain parts, and it can also be used by you as a developer. And there are Angular developers who absolutely love it, and there are developers who don't like it at all. But here in this course, we'll use the basics of this RxJS library, since you should know about it, and we'll use one specific feature here, which allows us such a subscription to changes that will allow us to trigger events in that messages list component. For that, I'll start here in that service though, because it's here where the change happens. And in there, I'll start by importing something from this RxJS package. And that something is a so-called behavior subject, which is kind of like a signal. Now, if you know RxJS, please don't kill me. I know there are many differences, but in its core, this indeed is a thing that allows you to create a wrapper around a value, and it then also allows you to set up subscriptions to changes to that value. Now, there also are many differences compared to signals, but you can use such a behavior subject to wrap a value and let others know when that value changes. And that's a functionality we need here. Therefore, here in this service, I'll add a new property, messages $. And this is a special naming convention that's typically used for RxJS related variables or properties. So variables or properties that hold values that are managed with help of RxJS. They are typically named like this, though that's not a technical requirement. That's just something that has been established over all those years. And the value I want to store in this property is a new behavior subject. So behavior subject is a class which can be instantiated to create a new subject, a new wrapper, therefore, around some value. Indeed, like a signal, behavior subject then takes an initial value as an input. And it's also a generic class which allows you to add extra type information to it, so that we can let TypeScript know which kind of value will eventually be managed here. In this case, I'll let Angular know that this will be an array of strings that will be managed here. Now, with that subject being set up here, we can go to add message, and after updating our messages, we can use this subject and call the next method on it, which allows us to emit a new value in the end. And the value I want to emit is my updated messages. Now, you could solve this all in a bit of a more elegant way if you fully embraced RxJS, but in order to keep things simple and hopefully understandable, I'll use it like this. I'll set up that behavior subject, I'll manage the messages in a separate property, and after updating those messages, I'll emit a new event, if you want to call it like this, through that behavior subject, which carries the updated data. Now we can use this behavior subject here to set up a so-called subscription to be notified about new data. So to be notified whenever this event here is emitted. And for that, we can go back to the messages list component. And there we could use ng-on-init to set up this subscription. That would be a great place for that. So let's implement the on-init interface, which is imported from Angular Core. And let's then add this ng-on-init method here. And now we can use the messages service and access this messages $sign subject and call the subscribe method to set up a subscription. And subscribe then takes a function which will be executed by RxJS whenever a new value is emitted by that subject. And it's now in here where we can use this change detection reference thing here to call the mark4check function, which will tell Angular that it should check this component in which this function is called and into which this change detector has been injected, that this component should now be checked for changes. And we could now actually also change the code a little bit and change messages from being a getter to being a regular property, which initially holds an empty array, let's say. Though I'll set the type to string array to make it clear which kind of value will be stored here. And then here in this subscription method, we could also set our messages to the messages we get from this subject. Because in our service, when I emit this value here, I'm passing my messages along with that event. It is the value I'm emitting after all here. So we can use that value in the place where we subscribe. And actually here we also might want to emit such a copy so that in the place where I do subscribe, I can't accidentally change the array that's managed here. But the key thing is that I do pass this array along with the event, so to say. And therefore in the place where I subscribe, I will actually get my messages here as a parameter automatically. It will be passed into this function by RxJS. And therefore I can override my locally managed messages with the messages from the service, and this value will be updated whenever a new message is added with help of the service. And then, thanks to mark4check, I make sure that change detection runs for this component. With that, if I reload, and I again wait for my timers to expire here, if I enter a new message and I click save, you see that now the message appears here and that messages list log is here because now the component has been checked because we did now trigger that manually. If I were to remove that, so if we would not mark this component for checking, and I would then enter a message here, this would still not work. So the usage of RxJS alone is not enough. I am just using it here so that I have a place where I can trigger change detection manually. Now, if you are using RxJS, then you should actually also clean up this subscription here so that if this component were to be removed, because it's maybe rendered conditionally, which is not the case here, but which could be the case in other applications, so that if that component were to be removed, this subscription would be cleaned up and you don't end up with subscriptions going on behind the scenes, even though they're not needed anymore. And to clean up this subscription, you could use the ng-on-destroy hook or simply add a new property here, which I'll name destroy_ref, where I inject the destroy_ref value. And you learned about that earlier in the course as well. This can then be used here in ng-on-init to call this destroy ref on destroy and register a function that should be executed if this component is about to be destroyed. And now subscribe conveniently returns a subscription value, which we can store in a constant that could be called subscription. And we can then use this here in this onDestroy code to call unsubscribe, which will clean up this subscription if this component here should be removed. It's not really required here because this component is never removed, but it is a good practice to follow and something you want to get used to. So that's therefore how you could make sure that this component is checked for changes and is updated when using a service when not using signals. This is then a way of making sure that the app still works as it should.